Mr. Hunt, picking things up at the end of 2015, your statement tells us that in December 2015 there was the announcement of the public consultation on the reform of the schemes. You've set out the timetable in your statement. I don't think we need to go to the underlying documents, but just in terms of dates. The consultation ran between January and April 2016, and then the results of the consultation and the government response were published in July of 2016. I just want to pick up a couple of documents arising out of those events. First is at WITN 39030006. If we go to the second page, we can see it's another minute from Claire MacDonald to the Prime Minister, dated the 5th of July 2016. And then it refers to the introduction of the new scheme, and it says in the first bold paragraph, the Department of Health are ready to announce a new, more generous compensation scheme for people infected with contaminated NHS blood products. The details are set out in this note for your agreement. If you would like to announce this £125 million of new investment, you could do so at PMQs on the 20th of July, or DH could put this out themselves more quietly. And then, I don't think I need to go through the detail of it, but there is a description of main features of the new scheme. If we just go to the top of the page and just look at the handwriting from Mr. Cameron again, I'm not quite sure what the first word is, but something...
Thanks.
Thanks. Good work. I would like to announce it. It is less than the sufferers want, but without my intervention, this would not be happening. So let's go for it. Do you have any observations I've been asked to ask you on what's set out there?
Well, he did make the decision to go for that middle option, the 125 million, not the 25 million option that his number 10 officials advised him to go for. And so I think it is true that, he did make an intervention to increase it. But I think that note also demonstrates that he understood that it wouldn't be the solution that people were looking for.
And I think picking it up from dates in your statement, those plans were announced by the Prime Minister in July 2016. Now, there was then... we've explored details of the schemes with other witnesses, so I'm not going to go through the detail of how the scheme changed and the payments with you, Mr. Hunt. But we know, and you referred to it in your statement, that there was then a later consultation in the spring of 2017, and that was about something called the special category mechanism. And again, I'm not going to take you to the detail of that. But there is just one thing I wanted to pick up with you from that time. It's CABO 40105. This is a letter from the 20th of February 2017. It's from Lord O'Shaughnessy, Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for Health and the Lords, to Amber Rudd, the Home Secretary. And we can see the heading is Infected Blood, Reform of Financial and Other Support. It says, I'm writing to seek Home Affairs Committee agreement to publish a new consultation, and then it explains it follows the earlier consultation. What's the reason for having to seek Home Affairs Committee agreement to undertake a consultation?
Because for domestic policy, there's a subcommittee of the Cabinet, which is the Home Affairs Subcommittee, which Amber Rudd chaired, which would approve things that were not deemed necessary to go to full Cabinet.
And then if we can go to the third page, we can see the heading, Collaboration with Devolved Administrations. It says the consultation response relates to scheme reform in England only. And then it says this, Scotland announced its own scheme reform in March 2016. It'll be for ministers in Wales and Northern Ireland to decide how to provide for beneficiaries within their jurisdictions. The government in Wales is considering the outcome of a survey to those affected by the infected blood tragedy in Wales to inform its decision on infected blood reform from 2017-18. The government in Northern Ireland announced on the 22nd of December 2016 that it plans to replicate the English scheme as had been announced July 2016. So we can see from this, as from other documents, that what had been a UK-wide scheme with the various Alliance House organisations dealing with individuals from England, Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland became 4 devolved schemes. And it's right to understand, I think, that the decisions that we were looking at before lunch in relation to payment and so on, and the consultation, refer to the English position only.
I believe so.
Do you have any understanding of how it was determined that what had been a UK-wide system would become 4 national schemes?
I'm afraid I don't. I should know, but I'm afraid I don't.
And then can I ask you to look next at a letter from Diana Johnson MP to Lord O'Shaughnessy. It's CGRA 00011031. This is 3rd of April 2017, and she says this in the first paragraph: I'm writing as the co-chair of the APPG on haemophilia and contaminated blood to express my concerns about the planned reforms to the English Reformed Support Scheme for those affected by the contaminated blood scandal. Please also consider this my formal response to the Department of Health's consultation on special category mechanism and financial and other support in England. She then refers to the government announcement of the support scheme in a written ministerial statement in March, and then says this: I will set out 3 concerns about the proposals as they stand. And I just wanted to ask you about that. Her first concern is expressed in these terms: firstly, and most crucially, I feel that the consultation neglects the fundamental issue which lies at the heart of all of the concerns raised by APPG members. It is this: whilst the government has recognised clear needs which need to be met within the affected community, it is not willing to put enough money forward to meet these needs. Was she right in your view?
Yes.
She then sets out a number of other matters in relation to that, which I don't propose to ask you about. If we go to the second page, bottom half of the page, her second concern is in the penultimate paragraph, where she says, secondly, I must express deep concerns about the uncertainty over the future discretionary budget. And then she talks about the consultation document and the impact assessment, and then in the bottom few lines talks about some parliamentary questions that she'd asked about what was meant in real money terms for those affected. Continues, the Department of Health clearly has a figure on what these cuts will mean, and I would be grateful if you could provide it as a matter of urgency. Are you able to provide any views on the second concern about the uncertainty over the future discretionary budget?
I'm afraid I'm not. I'm not really aware of what that issue is about.
Okay. And then the third concern, I think, is a more straightforward one. So if we look further down this page at the penultimate paragraph, she says this: finally, I write to reiterate my long-standing concerns about the lack of support for the bereaved. Many of the bereaved understandably feel that with a smaller discretionary fund than promised, they'll receive less than they had before. The small £10,000 ongoing payment, which is now being paid out, offers scant reprieve from this. And as stated earlier, many widows have fallen short of the strict eligibility criteria for this. And then she continues in the last paragraph to say, I can only reiterate my strong feeling that until more funding is announced, I regret that the government's proposals will continue to rightly attract huge concern and a considerable level of worry amongst a group of people affected through no fault of their own. Do you, or what is your view on her concerns about the support for the bereaved and the adequacy of what was proposed in relation to the bereaved?
Well, I think I made it clear in my advice to the Prime Minister before in that letter that you showed up that I didn't think that the 125 million would satisfy campaigners. I didn't think it would close the issue. It was a small step in the right direction, but only a small step in the right direction. And I think this demonstrates that point, that it was very much unfinished business.
Now, what resulted, obviously, were the four national schemes, or the four devolved schemes, and a lack of parity between those four schemes. So the inquiries previously heard there were things available in Scotland that weren't available in England, Wales and Northern Ireland, and things available in Wales that weren't available in England, Scotland and Northern Ireland, and so on. Were there any discussions, to your knowledge, at a departmental or ministerial level about the four schemes and what could be done to ensure that there was parity between them?
Not at my level. There may well have been at a junior ministerial or an official level. But unfortunately, I think that's something that we had no control over legally because of the devolution settlement. It's not logical at all that something that was a UK-wide issue that happened when the NHS throughout all four nations was run by the UK government, but that changed in 1997, and so we genuinely didn't have any control. I could imagine a situation in which the four nations decided to act in concert with a single scheme. I don't know whether that was explored or not, but there weren't the best of relations at a political level because England, Wales and Scotland were being run by different political parties. So I don't believe any of those discussions happened.
Would you agree that there, bearing in mind, as you say, these were events that had happened across the United Kingdom pre-devolution, that there should not have been significant disparities between what you might get in Scotland and what you might get in England, Wales or Northern Ireland, when you've suffered the same loss?
Yeah, I could use the words there should not have been a difference, but there was a conflict between two different things that we as a country had democratically decided. One was the devolution settlement, which did give Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland genuine autonomy over health matters, and so we wouldn't have had an ability to impose a single scheme across the United Kingdom.
Can I then just flag up one further submission, which is at DHSC 0050103. If we go to the third page, this is a submission of the 12th of September 2017, and we can see the issue says number 10 has responded saying that they want the uplifts to be funded from DH's existing budget without additional funding from HMT and to publish by the 14th of September. We can see a discussion in the first four paragraphs. So it's said in the paragraph 1, in response to a submission setting out reforms to the infected blood payment schemes, you asked the infected blood team to consider options if the payment scheme funding envelope was increased. And then paragraph 2, you and the Secretary of State agreed that discussions should be held with number 10 to explore options to reinstate annual payment uplifts from 2018-19, previously announced in 2016 but not yet implemented, and to increase the overall level of discretionary funding available. An additional £4 to £22 million per annum would be required from HMT, as finance colleagues confirmed that DH does not have the money for this. And then 3, number 10 confirmed that they would like to see the additional funding from DH's existing budget. The DH finance team are working to identify the funds in the existing budget. And then if we go over the page to paragraph 9, which is the 4th paragraph on the page, into the heading finance, number 10's requirement to deliver all components of the 2016 scheme from within existing DH budgets results in unfunded costs from 2018-19 for the remainder of the spending review, in which existing commitments outside of the NHS mandate substantially exceed the funding available. Options will be presented to the Secretary of State on the options for cutting other budgets in order to support delivery of the number 10 infected blood commitment. Now, it would appear from this, and I think you or your office may have been copied into this, but it was obviously not addressed to you. But it appears from this that, again, the department was being told it had to find any additional money for the uplifts there described from within its own budget. No extra money is available from the Treasury.
Correct.
As far as you can recall, during the time you were dealing with this issue of the payment schemes, was any additional money ever forthcoming from the Treasury?
No.
Were any written cases ever submitted to the Treasury for consideration, or was it more a question of don't even go there because the answer will be no?
It wasn't quite don't even go there, but in a way we had a very, I mean, we knew that the Treasury's answer would be no, so our only chance of them changing that would be if number 10 decided the answer should be yes. And we did have very regular communication with number 10, in which we were essentially asking number 10 if they would support us in asking the Treasury for additional funding. But as you saw from the early exchanges with number 10, the answer always came back exactly the same, that this had to be met from DH's existing funding requirements. I mean, the national finances were under very great pressure. You know, we had a huge deficit. And at the time of that memo, I do remember it was the time when the DH's finances were at their worst ever. We had, I think, from memory, something like £1 billion of savings that we needed to find over the financial year in order to get the books to balance, and we didn't know where it was going to come from. And, you know, I basically negotiated the following June a £20 billion rise in the NHS budget. If I hadn't been able to do that, we would not have been able to balance our books.
And just so that we can understand what's being said in paragraph 9 there, the reference to the NHS mandate, is that effectively the ring-fenced monies?
Correct.
To provide for essentially NHS services?
Yes, which, you know, was about 70 or 80% of the money that came into the Department of Health went straight to the NHS and the legal document was the NHS mandate. That was what we asked the NHS to do with the money.
But by the time you left office in 2018, is this right? There was the new scheme, an English scheme now rather than a UK-wide scheme. In terms of additional funding, and leaving aside what additional funding might or might not have been made available in relation to the uplift issue here, there was the 125 million, which was found within existing departmental budgets, nothing from the Treasury.
Correct.
When I think it was Sir John Major gave evidence to the inquiry, he used the analogy in terms of government decision-making of a tanker, a super tanker, and the length of time it can take to get that super tanker to change direction. It might be said it took an awfully long time from 2012, 2013, when those first submissions from 2013 were looking at the schemes, to get to the replacement English infected blood support scheme 2017-2018, with very little additional funding.
Yes, it took too long. And I think when you look at the anguish that families are facing, but actually the simple fact that people were dying without getting access to the additional compensation for their families or support that they needed with their lives. I don't think anyone can be proud of the performance of the British state over the last 25 years, but during the period I was in office, and this is not to excuse it, but the bottom line was that there was a big financial issue and we had a huge national deficit. And so, it was like we were trying really hard to do something, but we just didn't have the ability. I'm talking about it from the Department of Health's point of view. We didn't have the ability to do it. And as someone who cared a lot about patient safety issues, I was able to, commission a second Francis report after Mid-Staffs, a report into Morecambe Bay, the Ockenden report into Shrewsbury and Telford, the Gospel report. And I was able to make progress in a number of other areas, but it was immensely frustrating that in this area, because the quantum of money involved was billions, not hundreds of millions, and I just didn't have that at my disposal. Progress was, I think you could only describe it as painfully slow.
And it might be said, or it might be a submission that's made to the inquiry in due course, that even with the changes that were made, what the scheme that emerged at the end still fell a very long way short of addressing the injustice, to use a phrase that you've used.
Well, that's my view, yes.
Can I turn to consider the question of a public inquiry and pick that up in your statement? So if we could go back to WITN 3499001. And if we could go to page 5, please. In paragraph 0.4 at the bottom of the page, you say this: when I did become Health Secretary, it was made clear to me that the Treasury would not support an inquiry because of the potential cost to the taxpayer which, taking into account any decisions on financial support which might follow, such as a recommendation for a compensation scheme similar to that in place in Ireland, could amount to billions of pounds. I did not therefore pursue the issue and follow the official government line in correspondence with all campaigners. Can you help us in understanding who made it clear to you that the Treasury would not support an inquiry?
This was conversations that I had with Treasury ministers and also conversations that we've talked about with Number 10 as well, which, operated as one with the Treasury throughout my entire time as Health Secretary, well, except certainly under David Cameron and George Osborne's time. So it was just made very clear to me the whole time that any funding for this would have to come from money received by the Department of Health.
And in terms specifically of the institution of an inquiry, did you push back against that? Before we get to 2017, did you make representations and try and challenge the line that was being given to you?
Well, basically, I knew, and Number 10 and Number 11 knew, that a public inquiry would be likely to recommend large sums of money, compensation, support for families that would have to be funded centrally, not from the department's budget and the NHS's budget. So that was why, because of the independence of an inquiry, the power of an inquiry is that, as you are very well aware, the power of an inquiry is that it's very difficult in practice for a government to reject any recommendations that are made by a public inquiry. It has, it does it in enormous detail, as you're doing, and its recommendations have tremendous moral authority. So I think everyone understood that if there was a public inquiry and it made a recommendation of, whatever the compensation was, that would have to be funded by the Treasury. And so, therefore, it was clear to me that number 10 and the Treasury would not support a public inquiry. But I felt, as I said to you before, that there was a very big injustice. So I was looking out, if you like, for when a moment might come that position might change. And it did come. Maybe we're going to go on to talk about that.
We'll come on to that in 2017. But just to go back to my question, does it follow from what you've said that in practice you did not push for a public inquiry because you were confident in your own mind that would get nowhere?
I wasn't just confident in my own mind. I mean, I knew the answer was no. If you look at all the responses that we had from number 10 to the discussions about much more minor improvements that we would make, it was very clear that they believed that every penny of support to resolve this issue would have to come from the Department of Health's own budget.
And then I think we can get a sense of the government line that was then promulgated on the issue of a public inquiry and communications with campaigners and individuals from DHSC 6736736. Now, this is not a response from you. It's a response that's been provided on your behalf, and I'm afraid this looks like a draft letter, so it doesn't look as though we can be clear as to who it's from. But we can see from the first paragraph, somebody in any event is replying on your behalf, and it looks like we're dealing with late 2012. The third paragraph says this: as I expect you know, it has been the view of successive governments that after all this time there is no justification for a public inquiry into the matters relating to NHS-supplied contaminated blood or blood products in England. The relevant facts are already in the public domain, and then reference is made to documents being published in line with the Freedom of Information Act. Now, it might be said, Mr. Hunt, that line, and we've seen it in earlier documents, we'll see it in later documents, was disingenuous, because from what you said, the real reason for not holding a public inquiry was the concern that it might lead to recommendations for the payment of compensation, which the government didn't want to have to find.
I'm not trying to defend that line. It's wrong. And that is the kind of groupthink that was in the government that basically said that this scandal happened because, good people were trying to do their best. Something terrible happened. It wasn't anyone's individual fault. And therefore, when it comes to compensation, the matter is closed. That was the view of successive governments, and indeed, we didn't have any reason to think that some of the stories that we've heard subsequently that clear evidence that people were being infected was overlooked by key people at the time in the 1970s and 80s. I felt that irrespective of whether people have been deliberately infected, more compensation should be paid, because this was a terrible thing that had happened, and it was an injustice in its own right. And so that was my basis for wanting to see if there were ways that we could get more compensation and more support to the families. But that is the sort of, I suppose, the legal line, that because, my own belief, but you're going to come to this conclusion in your inquiry, is that it's wrong, but my own belief is that it's not correct, but it was the public line, and I didn't have any reason to deviate from that, and indeed I was obliged to follow collective responsibility as a health secretary, even though, as you know, I personally felt that we needed to do more.
And just so that others listening can understand that reference to collective responsibility is that the convention that as a cabinet minister you publicly articulate a government line, and if you are not willing to do that, you resign.
Yes, and that means that you have to publicly defend lines that you privately have argued against. So, at this time, I thought the NHS needed more money, and I was arguing for more money, and I was writing to Theresa May asking for more money for the NHS. But if I had been asked on the Andrew Marr show, has the NHS got enough money, I would have had to say yes, because that was the official line as agreed by the whole of the Cabinet. Now, that might sound wrong, but that's actually the way government has to function, that you agree something as a group of people and you all defend that line until that group of people in the Cabinet decide something different. It is sort of the way it has to work for government to function.
Can I just ask you to look again at the letter you wrote to Mr Cameron in June 2015, CABO 40163_003. We looked at the detail of what this said in terms of the issues regarding financial support. But if we could go to the last page, you say this in the second paragraph. In terms of handling, I would suggest a normal statement by Jane Ellison launching the consultation on scheme reform and responding to the Penrose recommendation. I do not propose to publish a substantive response given that this was a Scottish inquiry and Scotland do not intend to respond. And then this. Should there be calls for a further inquiry in England, I recommend that they be rejected, as all our documentary evidence will be in the public domain very shortly, and further inquiries would hinder scheme reform. Now, this isn't a public document or a letter to a campaigner. This is you writing to the Prime Minister. If it was your view that there should be a public inquiry, why were you recommending to the Prime Minister that such calls should be rejected?
Because at that stage it had been made very, very clear to me that any additional funding that a public inquiry might decide was necessary would have to come out of the NHS budget. And we had completely run out of money in the NHS. And because I knew that was the very clear position of the government at that time, then I didn't know where we could possibly find the money that would have been recommended by a public inquiry. When I was able to get the Prime Minister to agree to a public inquiry, it was without the caveat that the money would have to come from the NHS's budget or the Department of Health's budget. And so that's why I was able to recommend it, and I was obviously delighted when Theresa May agreed to it.
So if we move then to 2017, because I think prior to 2017, the line continued to be from the Department of Health and from the government, no need for a public inquiry, and I don't think we need to go to it, but there's I think a letter you wrote to Diana Johnson, and there's correspondence between Vaughan Gething, the Welsh Minister, and the department, in which that line is essentially maintained. But then you say this in your statement, so if we could go to WITN 3499001. Oh, sorry, Lawrence, page 6. It's the second paragraph, 0.6. I'm just going to read it out, and then I understand there might be a slight correction that needs to be made to the beginning of the paragraph. So it reads, in 2017, just 5 weeks after the Conservatives had been returned to office, but having lost their majority, Prime Minister Theresa May was going to have to respond to a parliamentary question on the issue. I sensed an opportunity to change the government position, and I've no doubt that it was because of the impression made on me by Mike Dorricott over many years. I had felt unhappy about the government position throughout my time in office, and thought this could be the moment, with the government distracted and weakened by the election result, to secure justice. I knew that from her response to the Hillsborough families as Home Secretary, Theresa May had a strong sense of duty to those whose voices were shut out by the system, but do not know if she consulted the Treasury before making her decision to hold a public inquiry, which to her great credit she did. Now, I understand that there may be a slight correction to make to or something to add to the first part of that paragraph.
Yes, I think it was not so much Theresa May having to respond to a parliamentary question, but to a parliamentary debate that would have been something that potentially the government would have lost. You say you sensed the opportunity to change the government position.
Can you just help us understand a little more what you mean by this?
So I thought that this was unfinished business, that we needed to give more support to the families. As I said here, you know, Mike Doricott, who very sadly died at this stage, was in my mind. But I also knew that it had been consistently blocked by the Treasury because of the potential cost implications. And here was a parliamentary situation which the government was going to have to respond to. I don't remember exactly what the motion was in Parliament and whether it was I don't think it was a binding motion, but there was something the government was going to have to respond to. And I had dealt with Theresa May over the Hillsborough inquiry, which we had both worked on together, and she was a very strong supporter of the Hillsborough families. And I knew that she had a very strong sense of the importance of securing justice in these kinds of situations. And I think that Diana Johnson deserves enormous credit for creating that parliamentary moment that allowed me then to make the argument to Number 10, we really should have a public inquiry, it's the right thing to do. And then to my delight, the answer came back yes, without any reference to the Treasury. Now, when the Prime Minister's decided something, the Prime Minister's decided something and it goes ahead. And I don't know whether the Treasury were involved in that decision or not, but it was a very, very important breakthrough.
And just to look at a handful of documents in relation to the decision finally to hold a public inquiry. If we start with DHSC 00500028, um, 7th of July 2017, so this is a submission. It addresses in part the question of funding options, but also the question of whether there should be an inquiry. And if we turn to page 3, please, Lawrence. We'll see the heading B, inquiry, and then it says this at paragraph 12. To date, the Department of Health's position has been that another inquiry would not be in the best interests of sufferers and their families, as it would be costly, delay action to address their concerns, and would curtail plans to reform the existing support schemes. The Department's published all relevant information that it holds on blood safety in line with the Freedom of Information Act 2000. There have also been 2 previous inquiries, the Archer inquiry and the Penrose inquiry in Scotland. Now, Mr Hunt, I understand these aren't your words because this is a submission produced by officials, but I just want to unpick that first sentence a little. From what you've said, the Department's position, or perhaps more broadly, the government's position, was indeed against an inquiry because it would be costly. But it's difficult to see how that could be said to be not in the best interests of sufferers.
Well, I don't think that paragraph was written by officials, and I don't think it's. I think ministers have to take responsibility for everything that happens in their department. So I would never blame any individual for that. But I don't think it's a very accurate representation of what the real score was. I think it is true to say that there is always a risk in an inquiry, in a public inquiry, that the government can use a public inquiry to kick issues into the long grass because they take several years. And so it is a reasonable point to make that there is a risk in a public inquiry that this happens. Although in this inquiry, I know that you are considering whether you make recommendations for interim payments, and Sir Robert Francis has published his views on that. So it doesn't have to be the case, but there is a risk of that. So it's not wrong to say that, but I think the real reason why the Department of Health's position was against a public inquiry was because they thought that the costs of any compensation that was decided by a public inquiry would have to be met from the NHS's budget, and that was the heart of it.
And then if we look at paragraph 13, it says, however, victims remain of the view that there's been a cover-up and are not satisfied by previous inquiries. Recent events, including the announced inquiry into the Grenfell Tower fire and recent media articles on infected blood, have increased the pressure to hold a public inquiry. And then there's reference to Andy Burnham, who the inquiry heard from, and the speech he gave during a German debate calling for a public inquiry. And I want to just look with you at some other materials that were being published at around this time. But before we do that, we can see if we go to, I think page 5 will suffice. And we can see in the conclusion, in the third line, you are also asked for a decision on whether to hold an inquiry on infected blood. And although we don't see from this version of the document who this is addressed to, is it right to understand that the you here is ultimately you as Secretary of State?
Yes, I don't remember if I saw that document. But I think what is important about that document, I mean, it looks like a real document. So what is important is that despite the fact that the Department of Health for many, many years had been saying we can't have a public inquiry, here is a document being written by officials for ministers as to what they need to think about if they're going to change that position. So I think it's very clear that there was a sense at the time that ministers might say, we do want a public inquiry, and then we need to be, knowledgeable about the facts so that we know what we are asking for and know what we're going to get.
And I just want to look at a media report and a couple of parliamentary reports from that first week or so in July, just to understand what role they may have played in the process. So if we go first of all to MDIA 40184, this is an article published Mail Online. The headline speaks for itself, NHS tainted blood, shame. But we can see the date is the 3rd of July. And then there is reference to patients being given deadly contaminated blood for at least 5 years after health officials became aware of the danger, damning documents reveal, reference to newly unearthed minutes, and then reference in the last paragraph to a major civil action to be lodged at the High Court today in which 300 families of victims are suing the government. And then the article continues over the page. I'm not going to invite your comment on the specific allegations, Mr. Hunt, but it's fair to say that the department would have known, first of all, of this article or articles of this kind, but would have known from this that there was also anticipated litigation.
Yes, I think they would have known there was anticipated litigation through sources other than the
sure
Daily Mail
right.
website.
Yes, I'm sure that's right. It's just a convenient mechanism for showing it to you. And then if we go to RLIT 301160, we can see this is Diana Johnson, to whom you paid credit a few minutes ago, 4th of July 2017. And it's described as a point of order. And it says this: in his final speech in the House, the former Right Honourable Member for Lee, that's Andy Burnham, made the very compelling case that there was evidence for criminal acts having taken place during the contaminated blood scandal, which was, of course, the biggest treatment disaster in the history of the NHS. Given that the criminal acts that allegedly took place are set out on the front page of today's Daily Mail, is it appropriate for the Secretary of State for Health to come to the House and say what action he intends to take? The former Right Honourable Member for Lee asked the Secretary of State to indicate whether he was minded to set up a public inquiry into what happened, and said that if that did not take place, he would notify the police of the evidence he had in his possession. So it would appear that as at early July 2017, there is pressure from a number of sources: the media, litigation, Parliament, and indeed Mr. Burnham's threat to take matters to the police. Would it be fair to infer that those all played a part in the thinking of the department and in your seizing the moment in the way that you described?
Yes, but I think that if I was going to sort of say what had the the biggest impact. I think it was probably not so much the media coverage, because the Department of Health is always dealing with unfavourable media coverage. I'm afraid that's a sort of fact of life in that department. I think the threat of legal action in terms of, what's described here as criminal acts, the department would have taken the view, well, that is a matter for the police, and if there's evidence of that, then, we'll cross that bridge when the police bring a prosecution. I think the real thing that caused, if I can put it this way, the goal to be open was the threat of losing a vote in Parliament, which was subsequent to this when the Speaker said that he would allow a debate. And I think that was really what allowed me to go to Theresa May and say, look, I think this is the right thing to do, and this is the moment to do it.
And we can see it at RLIT 0001161. Diana Johnson's proposal on the 10th of July 2017 that there should be a debate on that very issue, the establishment of an independent public inquiry. So that's what you were referring to.
Correct.
We know, if we look at CGRA 0001119, we know from the first paragraph that you decided that you were minded to hold an inquiry, and the date of that is the 10th of July 2017. We can see it from the first paragraph, and then it says, in accordance with the ministerial code, he would like to consult the Prime Minister for her views. And then that is the process that was undertaken with Theresa May agreeing to the establishment of an inquiry. Can I then just ask for your observation now on a different document, an earlier document, WITN 3499029. This is a document addressed to the Parliamentary Under Secretary of State for Public Health and to you. It's dated the 4th of July 2014, so it takes us back 3 years. But you'll see the relevance, I hope, from the title, Contaminated Blood, Transparency of the Historical Record. Because as we've seen, part of the line that was taken by the department was to say, well, we've placed documents in the public domain under the Freedom of Information Act, and therefore we don't need an inquiry. And I just wanted to ask whether you have any comments on paragraph 3. It says this, the preparation of records for release is a time-consuming and manual process. The process ensures that the right information is released to the public to avoid challenges and penalties. And then this, the Cabinet Office has asked departments to ensure that information is not unintentionally disclosed, which might open the department to litigation or penalties. Now, that might suggest something less than a transparent provision.
I totally agree. I mean, I don't think I saw this document, and it seems to me to be completely against the point of the Freedom of Information Act, and completely against the standard of transparency that all governments should aspire to. I mean, if the government becomes subject to litigation because these things come into the open, well, that's something the government has to cope with, but I don't think that should be a reason for not releasing things into the public domain.
So the Prime Minister's announcement of the inquiry was on the 11th of July 2017. She made a handful of observations when she made the announcement. I'm afraid I don't have the text of it on screen, but I'm just going to, as it were, repeat them to you. And I'm not asking you to comment on what the Prime Minister's view might or might not have been, but just to see whether this reflects your own thinking. She described it, as I recall, as an appalling tragedy which should simply never have happened. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
She described thousands of patients being failed. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
She said that victims and families who've suffered so much pain and hardship deserve answers as to how this could possibly have happened. Would you agree? She said they've been denied answers for too long.
Yes.
And that they should finally get the answers and justice they had spent decades waiting for.
Yes.
Now, in terms of the inquiry being established, or the decision to establish it being taken finally in July 2017, it's right, I think, to understand from your evidence that it's this combination of political and governmental pressures and financial pressures that led to the decision to establish the inquiry.
Sorry, I should have inserted the word financial. I didn't hear how the sentence was ending.
There was no new piece of information that came to the attention of government, was there, that meant an inquiry now was necessary when it hadn't been before?
I mean, potentially this allegation of criminal activity, but I don't think that was actually in the end the significant thing, no.
Would it be fair to say that it's ultimately the position that the government announced an inquiry that could and should have been established years or decades before? Would that reflect your view?
I think it is, yes. I think it's undeniable that this should have happened, decades earlier. And I think the question is how it is that it could have become a kind of established by the establishment, if I can put it that way, that nothing wrong was done, and that line then religiously stuck to by government after government, and the further away that we got from those incidents, the harder it came for a succession of ministers to challenge them, because it just became established as sort of received wisdom, as you could see from the documents that you showed me earlier. But I do think it's a very big failing of the state that we didn't have more openness earlier on. And it's not for me to say this, but I sincerely hope that one of the things that you will conclude as an inquiry is understanding how we can prevent that happening in the future on a completely apparently different set of issues. But essentially it was, I think it was trying to protect the reputations of people on the basis that they were trying their best, which then led to a lack of transparency about what happened and what mistakes were made.
I just want to pick up on a couple of matters relating to the Treasury. And in general terms, I don't think we need to look back at any of the documents. It would appear from your evidence that both in terms of enhancing, improving, extending the payment schemes and in terms of establishing a public inquiry, the central stumbling block, or a central stumbling block, was the desire not to use government money to pay for that. Is that fair?
Extra government money. Yes, and I think, look, it's a difficult thing to explain with the people in this room today, but the Treasury's job in some ways in government is to say no to lots and lots of spending requests that come from left, right, and centre. That's how they keep control of the national finances. And we did face in 2010 picking up the pieces from the biggest financial collapse since the Second World War. So it was a very difficult environment for the Treasury as well. And the country was in deficit in every single one of the years that we're talking about. So it was a particularly difficult period. But from my point of view, responsible for the Department of Health, it was made very clear to me that any funding at all to resolve this issue would have to come from the department's budget, which ultimately would have meant the NHS's budget.
It might be said that, in part for the reason that you've just referred to about the role of the Treasury, that the Treasury is always likely to take the line that there isn't more money and it doesn't want to provide more money to departments. If there's a sufficiently strong will across government as a whole, so leave aside the position of an individual department, the money can be found, can it not? And obviously was found, for at least for this inquiry.
It was, but in the end it took the Prime Minister to decide to do it. It took the Prime Minister to decide to require the Treasury to consent to it. And we did get to that point in the end, but it took too long.
Do you know whether an exercise has ever been done of anyone working out how much could have been saved ultimately if a proper scheme of compensation had been established in the late 80s or early 90s?
I'm not aware of any such exercise.
Can I then just come back to a handful of passages from your book, Mr. Hunt? RLIT 0001163. If we go to page 4, I want to pick up on the theme of transparency that we see set out not quite halfway down the page, but you say, my first instinct was to focus on transparency. All these avoidable deaths felt like a major scandal, but one that no one seemed to know about. There seemed to be a kind of omerta around avoidable deaths in the NHS. This was partly because people at the top of the service thought their political masters would not want the bad publicity, but it was probably more from an understandable worry that talking about such deaths would damage public confidence in the NHS. Unfortunately, the corrosive consequence of such thinking was all kinds of terrible cover-ups in which both the Department of Health and the NHS were sadly complicit. When problems like mid-staffs were identified, the default response was to try and sort them out behind closed doors without the public ever finding out. And then you talk further about transparency in the course of your book. Now, the inquiry's heard about the duty of candour in relation to NHS bodies. What about the duty of candour of government officials, government ministers?
Well, I think we do have a duty of candour, and that was why, with a succession of these tragedies and scandals, I thought the best thing was to set up independent inquiries. So I did it for, as we talked about earlier, for Morecambe Bay, for Shrewsbury and Telford, for Gosport, for Patterson. And I think very often the machine was very uncomfortable with the fact that I wanted to keep setting up independent inquiries to get to the bottom of what happened, because I became aware that I couldn't ask the department to do these inquiries, because that would be like asking them to mark their own homework. And so you had to ask someone trusted from outside to look into the issue. So the other thing that I did, which was, I think probably the most important change in transparency that I was responsible for, was to set up the Ofsted system for hospitals, GP surgeries and care homes, so that an independent inspector went round all of them, rating them as outstanding, good, requires improvement, or inadequate, so that the public would know if the care they were getting from an organisation was safe or not. And then I published data on surgery outcome rates by surgeon, and a whole bunch of other things wherever I could. I came to realise, though, just to give you a complete answer, I started by thinking it's all about transparency. I came to realise that transparency on its own is not actually enough. You have to then have a system where there is the energy and determination to change things on the basis of the data that you get. So sometimes you can sort things out just by transparency. It shocks the system into changing things. But sometimes, even after you've said the care in this hospital is poor, nothing happens. And so you do need to have an energy to sort out problems that goes alongside that transparency.
But if transparency and an ability to learn from mistakes is important for doctors and other healthcare professionals and NHS bodies, is it equally important for civil servants and for government ministers, particularly in a department such as the Department of Health?
It is. It's more difficult in an adversarial political system for politicians to say, I made a mistake, because someone in Parliament will stand up and say, he just told us he made a mistake last week. How do we know he's not making a mistake this week? And you get a lot of that yaboo. And, in my book, I wrote a whole book about some of the mistakes I think I made when I was Health Secretary. And I was actually surprised at how I didn't get that response from people. People actually welcomed someone who tried to write objectively about what happened. But I think that with civil servants, there are two things going on, which it's worth just unpacking, if you'll allow me.
Yes, absolutely.
Richard. I mean, the first thing is this desire, human desire really, to cover up mistakes or to gloss over them, sometimes to protect your colleagues, but it is a human instinct. But I think there's also, with civil servants, a desire to please their political masters. They're very conscious of the fact that they are civil servants who work for elected officials. So quite a lot of their advice may sometimes subconsciously be what they think their elected masters want to hear. So it may be that the civil servants who were responsible for this area actually did have their own private suspicions that something terrible happened in the 1970s and 80s, but weren't sure whether the politicians would welcome something that would mean billions of pounds of additional liability, so didn't confront us with those facts. It's not for me to make that judgment, it's for you to, obviously, with your careful examination of the evidence, to try to understand that. But I think sometimes the problem in our system is that civil servants don't want to confront ministers enough with difficult choices, and they can be too deferential, and that may have been a factor here too.
And that's an issue in fact you touch in your book. I don't think we need to go to the pages, but you touch both on the blame game in relation to politicians and the difficulties in a parliamentary system potentially of owning up to mistakes, and then that issue about civil servants and there being hierarchical constraints potentially on civil servants advising ministers, also in your book. One of the other topics you touch on in the book, and perhaps we will go to this, it's page 28, please, Lawrence. Is groupthink. This chapter is entitled Groupthink, and you describe it in these terms. If we look at the bottom half of the page, so it's the paragraph beginning, the answer is patchily, but picking it up in the second line, you say, let's look in more detail at the dangers of a consensus becoming so well established that no one wants to challenge it. And then you discuss that further, not least in the context of matters relating to the decision-making regarding COVID. Can you just perhaps elaborate upon that a little, that idea of...
Yes, I mean, I think the groupthink that I found most troubling was this idea that harming and killing some people is inevitable in modern healthcare systems. It's just going to happen. It's the price of doing business. And whereas if we organise things better, we should be able to stop all preventable harm and death. And it came home to me because, and I mentioned in the book, that a very early conversation I had with the medical director of NHS England, Professor Sir Bruce Keogh, who was a heart surgeon, and he described how one of his patients died after one of his heart operations. And he was very upset, and his colleagues said to him, Bruce, he had a bad heart, he was going to die anyway. And Bruce said, yes, but he wasn't going to die on Tuesday. And that, for me, is the problem with groupthink, is that you're trying to support your colleagues who are going through a stressful time, doing a very stressful job. And in medicine, you're taking life and death decisions. In a pandemic, you may be taking a decision which ultimately means who lives and who dies if you're having to decide who you're going to admit to an intensive care bed and you haven't got enough of them. And in that context, people try to reassure each other, and then they understandably try to convince each other that they weren't responsible for a death that they may have been responsible for. And I think it's important to say that in the vast majority of those cases, absolutely no one is to blame. But the result of that kind of groupthink of this was going to happen anyway, there's nothing that could have been done, is that you don't then have a proper examination as to whether things could have been done differently and led to a different outcome. And that's the concern that I have. And so I think that, there is that. And I think that might be a factor here.
And just before we leave these extracts from your book, if we go to page 33, you say at the bottom of the page, when I left the Department of Health after 6 years of focusing on the issue of avoidable harm and death, there were still 3 outstanding inquiries. And then over the page, you identify those as Gosport, the Cumberledge Review, and the review into maternity deaths at the Shrewsbury and Telford Hospital NHS Trust. I've been asked to point out to you that you don't identify this outstanding public inquiry.
And I should have. I mean, it's obviously a very, very important one. I could easily have done it, and I should have.
Can I then just ask you, in relation to the charity that you set up, Patient Safety Watch, if we could go back to your witness statement, please. So WITN 3499001, and it is it's page 13. Now, you refer in paragraph 4.2 to the establishment of this charity in September 2019. You explain about 5 lines down that the research looks at avoidable harm caused by day-to-day medical error rather than that caused by administrative or policy decisions, and that you're not looking at the issues with which this inquiry is concerned. But I just wanted to ask you about what you say in the very last 3 lines. You say, we do frequently come across the tendency of modern health systems to underplay, misrepresent or cover up patient harm and death. So those themes that you refer to in your book by reference to your time as Secretary of State for Health are themes that you have also encountered through the work that Patient Safety Watch undertakes. Is that right?
Yes, I mean, and that probably explains why I didn't mention it as a 4th outstanding inquiry, because my focus in patient safety has been on medical error, as in decisions taken in hospitals by doctors and nurses, or indeed by GPs, which have resulted in harm or death that could have been avoided, rather than what appears to have happened here, which was a decision taken by officials with respect to a national policy approach to blood products. And what Patient Safety Watch does is it simply commissions Imperial College London to look at that kind of medical error and to try and quantify the amount of avoidable harm and death we have every year in the UK, and they'll publish their first piece of research into that in a few months' time. So it's a slightly narrower focus, but the themes obviously overlap.
And then if I could then draw your attention to a report of the Health and Social Care Committee, RLIT 0001282. Now, this is a relatively recent report, April 2022, of the committee which you talked about this morning, which you chair. We can see it's entitled NHS Litigation Reform. It's a fairly lengthy report, and I'm not going to ask you to comment on the bulk of it. But one of the themes that has emerged from the evidence that this inquiry has heard was a concern on the part of officials and ministers not to provide financial support because of what was seen as a slippery slope to no-fault compensation. And that idea of no-fault compensation or compensating people outside of court actions for clinical negligence is one of the central issues in this report. Can you just tell us in a nutshell what the conclusions were of the committee in the report?
Yes, and by the way, we're not the first people to make this recommendation. I think Sir Brian's very familiar with the approach that we took from his own work on the Bristol inquiry. But I think there is a crossover in a way to the issues you're considering here. So the example that we give here is that if a baby is born severely disabled, at the moment under the law, maybe the child has cerebral palsy because of errors made in the birthing process, the only way that the family can get compensation is if they can prove clinical negligence, either by the clinicians involved or by the hospital. And of course, they desperately need that compensation because they've got a disabled child to bring up, and it's that child will have a lot of needs. And so you end up with a legal process that can last between 5 and 10 years. And then they might get a multi-million-pound settlement, but they didn't get the money when they needed it most, which was in the early years. And the doctors are incredibly defensive in the process because no doctor wants to be accused or convicted of clinical negligence. And the one thing that needs to happen most of all, which is to actually understand why it happened, because no doctor would do this on purpose, learn the lessons, change the procedures and spread the lessons around the rest of the NHS, is the thing that doesn't really happen. And in Japan, which is one of the examples we used in this, they introduced no-fault compensation for children born with severe cerebral palsy in 2008 or 2009. And they have had a 1/4 reduction in children born with severe cerebral palsy in that period. So it's immensely better, much, much cheaper. And I think last comment I'd say on this is that when I was Health Secretary, I was warned we can't have no-fault compensation in the NHS because it would be too expensive, because the vast majority of people who are harmed by the NHS don't take the NHS to court. But if you just had automatic compensation from a menu, then you'd end up paying money to lots of people who don't currently get paid anything, and that would end up costing a lot. To our astonishment, when we did this report, and that's what they do in New Zealand, when we looked at what happens in New Zealand as part of the research for this report, we found that actually it costs half as much as a proportion of all their health spending in New Zealand as it costs us in the NHS in England. So it is not only much better for patients because lessons are learned, but it's also much cheaper for the health system.
Finally, from me, Mr. Hunt, for present purposes, just 2 questions. The first is this. Your successor, Matt Hancock, when giving evidence to the inquiry last year, accepted that there was a moral responsibility on government to address the impact of what has happened to those infected and affected. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
Secondly, if we turn back to your statement, please, WITN 3499001, and go back to page 5. It's what you say in the last sentence of paragraph 0.3. I just wanted to draw attention to, not least because I understand that Mike's family are watching your evidence. You say this, it will forever remain on my conscience that I did not come close to delivering justice to Mike and his family whilst he was alive. And that remains your evidence.
Yes, and Mike wasn't the only person I met who was affected with the contaminated blood scandal. But I think it was universally agreed that he was a wonderful man. He was a very decent man. He could have been a lot angrier than he was, actually, and he was someone who I think understood the constraints that politicians operate under, and he was always very gentle and very decent. So I did remember him. I don't think it'll be any consolation to Anne, but I would say that I think thanks to Mike, and indeed thanks to Melanie and Steve and other constituents that I met, I probably was the first health secretary who came into office with a sense that this was something that was unfinished business, where justice had to be done. And I was also one of a long line of health secretaries over decades who wasn't able to resolve it, at least in my case, until the very end. But what I would say is that although in some ways you could look at this as a huge failing of our democracy, that it's taken so long to resolve this issue, I think in another way, the families and campaigners, including Mike, were entirely responsible for justice being done in the end by the way they campaigned, by the way they put pressure on all of us in Parliament, and created that moment in which the public inquiry should happen. So I think in that sense, sadly posthumously, Mike made a huge contribution to justice being done.
So those are the questions I'm proposing to ask. If we could now take our customary break to allow the legal representatives for core participants to suggest any further matters they want me to ask Mr Hunt.
Do you have any sense of how long it might be?
I think half an hour should suffice, the normal half an hour break. If we need longer, I will obviously let everybody know.
Well, we'll take a break until not before 3:45. Let me explain. The Act provides that those who are core participants in the inquiry, and it means what it says, participants, have a right to put questions to a witness through counsel to the inquiry. And plainly, before they can decide what questions they might want to ask, they have to listen to your evidence. They will have read it, but they won't necessarily have heard it and have formulated their questions as yet, and they must be given an opportunity to reflect and do that, and counsel herself to consider how best to put the question she's asked to do. So that takes a little while. It may take longer than half an hour, which is why I say not before 3:45. If there is a delay, it will be told. Everyone will be told, but otherwise we start then.